The Once and Future Present, Episode 6, Crisis of the 14th Century, Plague, War, and Upheaval, an AP European History podcast from Hammer History Productions. Hey everyone, welcome back to The Once and Future Present. I'm Casey, and today we're taking a deep dive into the 14th century, a time when Europe went through famine, plague, war, religious upheaval, and major social unrest. It's kind of amazing anything survived it. Joining me again are Professor Theo.
Hi, Casey. This is one of those centuries that really tests the resilience of societies. It was a chaotic time, but also one that led to major changes.
And Der Morgan.
Definitely. The 14th century may sound bleak, but understanding the breakdowns helps us understand the transformations that followed, especially the Renaissance and the Reformation.
And we're using Chapter 11 from McKay's A History of Western Society as our guide today. So let's start with the basics. What kicked off all this trouble?
The first big factor? Climate. Around 1300, Europe entered what historians call the Little Ice Age. Not a literal ice age, but a long stretch of colder, wetter weather that made it harder to grow crops.
Right? This led directly to the Great Famine from 1315 to 1322. There were widespread crop failures, especially in northern Europe. Grain prices soared, people starved, and even the animals started dying. It was a really hard time.
So, food shortages, weakened population, and then the plague hits?
Exactly. The Black Death hit Europe in 1347. It was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and traveled along trade routes, especially the Silk Roads, which connected Europe to Asia.
Wait, what were the Silk Roads again?
They were ancient trade routes that moved goods, silk, spices, tea, from East Asia to Europe. But unfortunately, they also carried diseases. When merchant ships from the Black Sea docked in Sicily, the plague entered Europe.
And it spread fast?
Very. It reached Florence in 1348, Paris and London by 1349. In just a few years, a third, maybe even half, of Europe's population had died. That's tens of millions of people.
It was terrifying. People didn't understand how disease spread. Some blamed bad air, others blamed divine punishment. Entire communities were devastated.
Did people try to stop it? Like, were there any early public health efforts?
Yes, actually. Some cities, like Venice, started requiring ships to quarantine for 40 days. That's where we get the word quarantine. Cities buried the dead outside town walls, and some passed rules to clean up waste. These were early public health steps.
How did people respond to the plague emotionally? It must have felt like the end of the world.
Absolutely. One of the more dramatic responses came from groups known as flagellants. These were men, sometimes hundreds at a time, who marched barefoot from town to town, whipping themselves in public as a form of religious penance. They believed the plague was a punishment from God for humanity's sins.
And at first, a lot of people supported them. Townspeople gathered to watch, and sometimes even joined in prayer. But their message started to go beyond personal repentance. They sometimes condemned the church, local rulers, and even merchants, saying the whole system was corrupt.
So they weren't just religious, they were political?
Exactly. Monarchs started to see them as a threat to their legitimacy. The flagellants questioned the ability of kings and bishops to protect their people or maintain divine favor. That's dangerous in a time when rulers claimed their power came from God.
And remember, this was a time of panic and instability. Any large traveling group with a message that challenged authority was seen as suspicious. In places like France and the Holy Roman Empire, rulers passed laws banning flagellant processions or sent soldiers to disperse them.
So even acts of religious devotion could become rebellious?
Yes, and that's a big theme in this century. The line between faith and politics got very blurry. Take, for example, the treatment of Jewish people during the plague. In many places, pogroms broke out, violent attacks against Jewish communities who were falsely accused of poisoning wells.
What's a pogrom?
It's a violent riot that is to some degree tolerated by the government and aimed at a particular ethnic or religious group. During the plague, thousands of Jews were killed across Europe. It's a dark part of this history.
The social consequences were huge, too. With so many people gone, there was a massive labor shortage. Wages started to rise as peasants and workers gained more bargaining power.
That seems like a good thing, right?
In some ways, yes, but the elites tried to shut it down. In England, they passed the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and the Statute of Labourers in 1351 to freeze wages and force workers to stay put.
Did that work?
Not really. You can't legislate away a labor shortage. Peasants still pushed for better conditions. This led to long-term changes in the feudal system. Serfdom began to weaken.
Can we pause there? What's the difference between a serf and a slave?
Good question. Serfs weren't property like slaves, but they were legally tied to the land. They couldn't move away or change jobs without their lord's permission. After the plague, many lords had to offer better terms just to keep their workers.
So you start to see a shift. More free peasants, more mobility, and rising expectations. But of course, not everyone was happy about that.
And that leads us to war, right? Let's talk about the 100 Years' War.
This conflict started in 1337 and lasted until 1453. So yes, it was longer than 100 years. It began with a dispute over the French throne. The English King Edward III claimed the crown, but the French gave it to Philip VI.
Why did England think they had a claim?
Edward's mother was a French princess, and he used that to argue he was next in line. But there were deeper issues: control over Aquitaine in southwest France, trade interests, and national pride.
The English won some big battles early on: Crécy in 1346, Poitiers in 1356, and Agincourt in 1415. Their longbowmen played a major role. They could shoot arrows far and fast, cutting down knights before they even got close.
So technology was shifting power.
Absolutely. It showed that commoners could defeat nobles. And then, in 1429, a young peasant woman changed everything: Joan of Arc.
She's the one with the visions, right?
Yes, she said that saints told her to support Charles VII and help him reclaim the throne. She led French troops to a major victory at the Siege of Orléans.
That's amazing. But then she was captured.
Yes, in 1430. She was put on trial for heresy and burned at the stake in 1431. But her legacy lived on. She became a symbol of French resistance and unity.
And back home, how did the war affect England and France?
Governments had to raise money for war, so they turned to representative assemblies like the English Parliament to approve taxes. These assemblies gained more influence.
Also, national identities began to form. People started seeing themselves as French or English, which hadn't been as strong before.
Can we backtrack for a minute? You mentioned that Joan of Arc was put on trial and burned at the stake. That seems like a big reaction.
Joan was not just a military leader for the French army. She became a threat to the larger social and political structure. Medieval society had a rigid legal system divided by gender. Men and women didn't just have different roles, they had different legal rights. Women were expected to be silent in public life, dependent on male relatives, and excluded from military and political roles.
So just by putting on armor, she broke the law?
In the eyes of some, yes. Joan wore men's clothing, which wasn't just unusual. It was explicitly outlawed under church law, unless for safety or necessity. Her cross-dressing was one of the formal charges at her trial.
And even before Joan, there were laws designed to keep gender roles fixed. The Statute of Cambridge of 1388, passed in England, legally capped how much women could earn, even if they did the same job as men. That law reflected the idea that women's labor was worth less and that they should remain in subordinate positions.
So gender inequality wasn't just social, it was written into the law?
Exactly. And when someone like Joan crossed those boundaries, leading men, speaking publicly, defying clerical authority, it threatened more than tradition. It undermined the legal and political systems built around those divisions.
And don't forget nationalism. Joan wasn't neutral. Her visions supported France over England, which made her a political enemy. When the English captured her in 1430, they wanted to discredit her and, by extension, Charles VII's claim to the throne.
So the trial wasn't really fair?
Not at all. The court was filled with pro-English clergy. They charged her with heresy, witchcraft, and cross-dressing, and found her guilty. She was burned at the stake in 1431.
But that wasn't the end. 25 years later, her conviction was overturned in a retrial, and in 1920, she was declared a saint by the Catholic Church.
That's a huge reversal, from condemned heretic to national hero and saint.
Exactly. Joan of Arc is a powerful example of how the systems of law, gender, and political power could turn someone into a criminal, and then a legend.
It's kind of wild that the law treated people so differently just because of their gender.
They saw the world differently, rooted in the idea of the great chain of being, and it wasn't just gender. In the 14th century, Europe also began developing legal systems that divided people by ethnicity and culture, too.
You mean like racism?
It's not quite modern racism yet, but it's definitely a step in that direction. Take the Statute of Kilkenny, passed in 1366 in English-controlled Ireland. It legally banned intermarriage between the English and the Irish, and outlawed Irish customs like speaking Gaelic, wearing Irish clothing, or using Irish names, even among English settlers.
The idea was that English identity had to be protected, and that mixing with the Irish would corrupt that identity. So the law tried to build a wall between the two groups.
So kind of like separating people into legal categories based on their ethnicity?
Exactly. Just like how laws created different rules for men and women, these new laws started drawing hard lines between ethnic groups, and when the legal system gives different rights to different groups, it sets the foundation for later systems of racial hierarchy.
It also ties into nationalism, the growing idea that people who share a language, a culture, and a common enemy should form a political community. You can see it in the French resistance to English rule, in Joan of Arc's symbolism, and here in the efforts to keep the Irish legally separate from the English.
So gender and ethnicity were both being used to define who had rights and who didn't.
That's right. The 14th century didn't invent inequality, but it started writing it into law in more permanent, more national terms. And those ideas will keep evolving into the early modern period.
Okay, so we've talked about famine, plague, and war, but it sounds like the church was falling apart too?
Absolutely. The church was supposed to be the one stable institution in people's lives, guiding them spiritually, blessing kings, and even running hospitals and schools. But in the 14th century, its authority took a serious hit.
It all started with something we call the Babylonian captivity, which lasted from 1309 to 1377. During this time, the Pope didn't live in Rome. He lived in Avignon, a city in southern France.
Why did the Pope leave Rome?
There were political struggles in Rome and pressure from the French crown. Pope Clement V, who was French, decided to move the papal court to Avignon. But many people across Europe saw that as a betrayal. They felt the Pope had become too closely tied to the French monarchy.
And the name Babylonian captivity is symbolic. It refers to the Old Testament story where the Israelites were exiled in Babylon. So this was seen as a kind of exile for the papacy too.
So people stopped trusting the Pope?
That mistrust only got worse during the Great Schism. In 1378, two rival popes were elected, one in Rome and one in Avignon. Then, in 1409, a third pope was elected in Pisa in an effort to resolve the conflict, and now there were three popes.
Wait, how does that even happen?
Because the church had no clear legal system for resolving a disputed election. Each pope claimed to be the true successor of St. Peter. And the kings of Europe lined up behind different popes based on their own political alliances.
So people in different countries had different popes?
Exactly. It was confusing and embarrassing. If the church was supposed to be the one true path to salvation, how could there be three men all claiming to lead it?
That led to the rise of the conciliarist movement, a group of theologians and clergy who argued that the church should be led by general councils, not just one pope.
Like a kind of church parliament?
That's a great comparison. And it eventually worked. In 1414, the Council of Constance was called. It deposed the other popes and elected Pope Martin V in 1417, restoring a single papacy.
So did that solve the problem?
It helped restore order, but the damage was done. Many Christians had lost confidence in the church's leadership. And others, especially in Northern Europe, were starting to push for much deeper reforms.
Some laypeople formed confraternities, religious brotherhoods that organized charity, ran hospitals, and held their own processions without waiting for church approval.
Kind of like taking faith into their own hands?
Exactly. And others went further, like John Wycliffe in England, who argued that the Bible, not the Pope, should be the highest religious authority.
He also believed the Bible should be translated into English so ordinary people could read it. That was revolutionary. He said the church's wealth was corrupt and that priests didn't need to be celibate.
That sounds like stuff we'll hear again in the Reformation, right?
Yes. Wycliffe is often seen as a forerunner to Martin Luther. His followers were called Lollards, and they were persecuted. But they kept his ideas alive.
And Wycliffe inspired Jan Hus, a priest and professor in Bohemia, that's modern-day Czechia. Hus also argued for church reform and preached in the local language. He had a big following, especially among the Czech-speaking lower classes.
Did the church go after him too?
Yes. He was summoned to the Council of Constance and promised safe conduct. But once he arrived, he was arrested and eventually burned at the stake in 1415.
His execution sparked outrage in Bohemia and led to the Hussite Wars, a series of religious conflicts that showed how deeply these reform movements had taken root.
So, we've got popes fighting, reformers being burned, and people forming their own religious groups. It sounds like faith was becoming political.
It was. The church's authority was tied to land, power, and kingship. And once people started to challenge that, the door was open for all sorts of changes in the 15th and 16th centuries.
Let's finish with the social unrest. There were a lot of revolts, right?
Absolutely. The 14th century saw uprisings across rural and urban Europe. After the Black Death, workers expected better treatment. But landowners and rulers tried to hold on to the old feudal system.
Let's take England. In 1381, the country saw one of the most famous revolts in medieval history, the Peasants' Revolt, also known as Wat Tyler's Rebellion.
Wait, who was Wat Tyler?
He was a craftsman, likely a roofer or tiler, who became the leader of the revolt. The rebels demanded lower taxes, an end to serfdom, and fairer treatment. Some even wanted the abolition of the monarchy altogether. Pretty radical stuff for the 1300s.
And serfdom is where peasants were legally tied to the land, right?
Exactly. Serfs had to work on their lord's land, pay rent in labor or goods, and couldn't leave the manor without permission. After the plague, many serfs had more bargaining power, but when the statute of laborers tried to freeze wages, tensions boiled over.
Then came the poll tax, a flat tax where every adult paid the same amount, regardless of income. That was the last straw.
In June 1381, peasants from the southeast of England marched on London, led by Wat Tyler. They attacked tax collectors, freed prisoners, and even entered the Tower of London.
Whoa, they got into the tower?
They did. They killed the Archbishop of Canterbury and other royal officials. It was a full-scale rebellion.
What did the king do?
King Richard II was only 14 years old. He promised to listen to the rebels, even met with Wat Tyler personally. But during one of those meetings, Tyler was killed by the king's men. After that, Richard revoked the promises he had made, and the revolt was crushed.
So nothing changed?
Not immediately, but it sent a message. The old feudal order was unstable. Over time, serfdom declined in England. Even if the revolt failed in the short term, the ideas didn't go away.
And it wasn't just in the countryside. Cities across Europe experienced unrest too, especially where the guild system limited economic opportunity for lower-class workers.
What's a guild again?
Guilds were associations of artisans or merchants who controlled a specific trade, like weaving, baking, or blacksmithing. They set prices, wages, and rules. In theory, they protected workers. In practice, they also excluded people from moving up.
In Florence, in 1378, there was a revolt of the Ciompi, wool carders and other low-wage textile workers. They demanded better pay and the right to form their own guild. They actually took control of the city for a short time.
Seriously?
Yes. But the elite struck back within a year. The movement was violently repressed, and many Chompi leaders were executed or exiled.
A similar pattern happened in Ghent, in what's now Belgium. Guild workers challenged city elites, sometimes successfully, but the backlash was usually brutal.
So was this all connected? The plague, the war, the church problems, and the revolts?
Absolutely. The 14th century was a pressure cooker, and when people felt betrayed by the systems that were supposed to protect them, government, church, nobility, they pushed back.
And while most of these revolts failed, they chipped away at medieval institutions and paved the way for the changes that came next, especially the Renaissance and later the Reformation.
Thanks for listening to the Once and Future Present. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our history-themed music projects by searching for Hammer History Productions on YouTube and Spotify. And as always, stay curious and think critically.